Ever since I read the entirety of the Franklin W. Dixon series, the Hardy Boys mysteries in elementary school, I've been a huge fan of the book series. And of course, that was reinforced when I discovered the fantasy genre in middle school, which kind of dominates this list. So I have about 40 years of book series to go through. So what are my top 10? Well, here goes. Number 10, the Foundation series. The Foundation series by Isaac Asimov consists of an initial trilogy, 2 sequels, and 2 prequel novels, with the original trilogy published in the 1950s and the following novels published between 1982 and 1993. The concept behind Foundation is of the high idea vein that classic science fiction is famous for exploring. In this case, a scientist using a new branch of sociology he calls psychohistory realizes that the current empire is doomed, so he makes strides to ensure the millennium of darkness that follows is shortened for all mankind. So I read Foundation about 10 or 12 years ago, and up to that point, even though I'd read a lot of fantasy, I wasn't a big science fiction fan. And this just captured my imagination. This was a much different kind of storytelling. Some of the things I love about fantasy stories, I love world building, and I love characters most of all. And this was not a character-driven narrative. It's very journalistically written, and the characters are kind of secondary. And what I continue to love about Foundation is the ideas. And that's why I've read a lot of classic sci-fi in the last few years, just getting into all these great ideas that these authors have come up with along the way. That's what readers of this genre value most. I freely admit, though, that I don't think I've found the science fiction book series for me. I have a few favorites. Foundation is the only one on this list, unfortunately. I have a few favorites, but I don't think I've found that one. But of all the science fiction series that I love most, Foundation is at the top of that list. Number 9, the Harry Bosch universe. The Harry Bosch universe is not a book series per se. Between 1992 and the filming of this video, Michael Connelly has written 40 works of crime fiction that are all set in the same fictional universe, with LAPD detective Harry Bosch being the central focus of a majority of those novels. While some of these works follow a detective, usually Harry Bosch, some of the books are legal dramas, while others follow a journalist. So the Harry Bosch universe, as I'm calling it here, is not a traditional book series. This isn't a book series where you start at book 1 and you progress through book 40. These are all essentially standalones, and you can pick up and leave off wherever you wish in the series. If you like a certain vein, if you like the legal thrillers, you can go that way. If you like the Harry Bosch novels, you can go that way. The one reason I had to include it on this list is twofold. One, I mentioned in my top authors video that Connelly is simply the best author I've read as far as consistency is concerned. His books are always of the 7 to 9 out of 10 variety. Just fantastically consistent author. The other thing is, for years, Michael Connelly was my slump buster. When I got in a reading slump, I read a couple bad books in a row. I knew all I had to do was pick up a new Connelly novel, and I'd be back to a trend of reading great books. So that's why the Harry Bosch universe had to be on this top 10 list for me. Number 8, A Song of Ice and Fire. A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin is arguably the most important and influential adult fantasy book series of its generation. Although currently unfinished, it has spawned multiple television adaptations and has influenced dozens, if not hundreds of authors since the first book, A Game of Thrones, was published in 1996. It is simply epic fantasy at its finest. Now, I wasn't sure if I was going to include this on my list, because for me, endings are important. I've had this discussion with other people, and a lot of people, if the ending isn't great but the journey is great, they're fine with it. But I think my background as a runner, when I was a racer, when I was a competitive distance runner, if I ran a marathon and I ran 23 great miles, and the last 3 miles I just folded, that's not a good race. And that's how I feel with a lot of book series. The journey can be great, but if the destination isn't great, it's going to tarnish what I feel about the series. So what do I do with The Song of Ice and Fire? We don't have an ending, unless you include the ending of the show, which I'm sure will be different than the books. Well, I thought about it, and I thought, well, what if George never finishes the series? Which is a possibility, I think a strong possibility. It's been 12 years since he published a book. By his own words, he's only about halfway through the 6th of these 7 books. He's getting up in age. Who knows if he'll ever finish? So I asked myself, if he never finishes, where does A Song of Ice and Fire rank for me? Well, it ranks 8th. I will say, though, that this is a series that could vault all the way to the top. This is some of the most remarkable storytelling you will get anywhere. What I find most remarkable is how he organically infuses so many different things together. It's epic fantasy, it's family drama, it's political drama, there's dragons, there's magic, it's character-focused drama, and it has some of the most brilliant plot twists you will find in the fantasy genre. It's remarkable how he fits all that together, and it doesn't seem like he's just trying to throw it together. It just weaves together so perfectly. I hope George finishes the series, but even if he doesn't, Song of Ice and Fire is a top 10 book series for me, and if you haven't read it, even though it's not done, I do highly recommend that you pick it up. Number 7, The Cosmere. The Cosmere by Brandon Sanderson isn't a book series, but rather Sanderson's interconnected universe that he tells his fantasy stories. Within the Cosmere at this time, Sanderson has 2 completed series, The Two Eras of Mistborn, plus an unfinished series, The Stormlight Archive, in addition to several standalone novels, a collection of short fiction, and a graphic novel. And these worlds are starting to connect in very interesting ways. So I talked about Sanderson on that author video as well, about how he always seems to stick the landing because he is one of those well-plotted authors. But what is most remarkable for me in the realm of the Cosmere is just, it shows Sanderson's imagination. All of these worlds are so different and they're so vivid. I can picture Roshar and Scadrial the most because I've read those the most, but all of the worlds just seem so different. History is present, lore is present, I can picture them vividly, magic systems are very unique. It just shows that Sanderson has an imagination that most authors just simply lack. Now, I have been critical of the combining of the Cosmere worlds within singular books. Most specifically in The Lost Metal, when I talked about that one in my November book wrap-up, I talked about how I felt that it detracted from the storytelling. The one thing that I am a little nervous going forward with the Cosmere is that his gloves-off approach makes these books feel less unique and more generic. And that's kind of what I felt in the middle of The Lost Metal. It's what I felt in the later MCU movies, that everything felt like it was the Avengers and it stopped being a Thor movie or a Captain America movie. I hope that as Sanderson moves forward in his Cosmere that we don't get that feeling that, oh, this is just a Cosmere novel, and we lack that distinct vividness of the worlds, which I love so much, and which is the biggest reason why I have the Cosmere on this list. Number 6, The Wheel of Time. The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan and completed by Brandon Sanderson upon Jordan's passing is a 14-book epic fantasy series that is considered by many to be the bridge between classic fantasy and modern fantasy. A series that begins very much like Tolkien's The Fellowship of the Ring. Jordan quickly went his own direction and explored many things not explored as deeply in most classic fantasy, including discussions of gender, exploration of a more concrete magic system, and exploration of mental health. Sanderson admirably concluded the series by penning the final 3 books based on Robert Jordan's notes. Now, I will admit there's a little bit of nostalgia in this pick, but not like you would think. Not nostalgia because I read this as a kid. I only read this a few years ago. But I took about a 15 to 20 year break from reading the fantasy genre. In those 15 to 20 years, the only new things that I had read were A Song of Ice and Fire and the Harry Potter books. So when I first read The Wheel of Time a few years ago, I read it very quickly in the span of 4 or 5 months. And what it did is it brought me back to this genre that I loved so much as a kid. I still love the genre. I was still rereading The Lord of the Rings. I was still rereading a lot of the works that I read in the 80s and 90s. But I hadn't read much new. And I'm so thankful to The Wheel of Time for bringing me back. It introduced me to the rest of Sanderson's works, as well as 2 more authors that are higher up on this list that I probably wouldn't have read had The Wheel of Time not brought me back into reading fantasy genre, which is right now probably about 3/4 of what I read each month. But beyond that, I do feel that this is a great book series. It has a fantastic ending. Sanderson / Jordan stuck the landing. And the ending was really, really great. Additionally, the journey is great. There are elements that it's not perfect. There is the slog. I think it's a little overblown, but it's there. The whole 10th book I could have skipped, and parts of the 8th book as well, but the slog is real. There are issues of character motivations. There are some narrative choices that will frankly make you shake your head. But the world building is incredible, especially in terms of history and culture. It's a fantastic, epic book series that I love to this day. And I will add one thing. There are critics of Jordan's writing style saying that it's maybe overwritten and it's repetitive. And I won't refute that, but I will say that when Sanderson took over in volume 12 of the series, I missed Jordan's writing style. Number 5, The Dark Tower. The Dark Tower by Stephen King is a 7-book series with an 8th book added later, published between 1982 and 2004, and is considered by many to be Stephen King's magnum opus. This is a book series that defies a genre tag. Is it fantasy? Is it science fiction? Is it a Western? Is it metafiction? Is it literary fiction? It's all of those and none of those. And while not perfect, represents some of the boldest storytelling you will encounter anywhere. Bold is not a strong enough description to say where King takes this story. He goes directions that some authors don't have the imagination to go, and he goes some directions that authors just simply would not go. And he's always had that boldness in his writing, including in his early works, before he had the clout of being a Stephen King that could write whatever he wished. So why is it great? It's an epic journey that is so unique. It follows one of the most memorable literary characters I've met, Roland Deschain, the gunslinger. He's part of this ancient sect of knights, and he has this quartet, this fellowship that is equally memorable. Some of the most brilliant characters King has created, and King's a great character writer, but some of the best ones are in this series. Even if there is one narrative element towards the end of the series that I wished he hadn't gone there, you have to just admire his willingness to just gloves off, do what he feels best for his story. Now, the ending is a bit divisive. I love the ending. I don't love that one narrative point that I alluded to, but I love the ending of The Dark Tower. The ending of The Dark Tower causes me to think about it more than any other book series I've ever read, including the 4 above it on this list. Number 4, The First Law Universe. The First Law Universe by Joe Abercrombie consists of 9 novels and 1 collection of short fiction, all published between 2006 and 2021. Although technically an initial trilogy called The First Law, followed by 3 standalone novels and a work of short fiction, followed by another trilogy called The Age of Madness, this series is really a 10-book epic. Considered the gold standard of grimdark fantasy, Abercrombie is one of the most unique narrative voices currently working in the genre. Yes, if I separated these trilogies, they would both be on this list. And if I separated Sanderson, we'd have 2 entries on the list, as well as another author that I haven't talked about yet. So I had to put these together, or else this top 10 list would have been dominated by 3 authors. But even so, I did see in an interview where Abercrombie did say that he secretly wrote a 9-book epic. And he really does, as some of the characters are present for all, if not most of the books. Some of the character arcs start in the standalones and finish in the second trilogy, or start in the first trilogy, end in the standalone. So you really need to read all of these, and you should, because Abercrombie is a master. He is one of my favorite authors. He has a very unique narrative voice. He has an ear for dialogue, which is unsurpassed. He creates some of the most memorable characters you will read anywhere. And he creates great action sequences. I mean, he pretty much does it all. His prose is very stylized, so some people don't connect with his writing style, but if you do, if you like Abercrombie, chances are you don't just like Abercrombie. Like me, you love Abercrombie. Number 3, The Warlord Chronicles. The Warlord Chronicles by Bernard Cornwell is a trilogy of historical fiction published between 1995 and 1997. Cornwell is one of the masters of the action-adventure side of historical fiction. In this trilogy, Cornwell asked himself, what if King Arthur had been a real person? What would his life have been like, as well as all of the other characters from this legend's lives, to give rise to this legendary story still told and retold generations later? What results is one of the most inventive book series you'll ever read. Warlord Chronicles did 2 things for me personally. It got me really interested in Arthur retellings. Hearing a story you know from a different slant is something I never tire of. In fact, I'd love to hear a lot of other legends done this way as well. And it's been happening. We start to see Greek and Roman mythology being retold in a lot of different ways. But Cornwell was doing this 25 years ago. And the other thing it got me really interested in was historical fiction, starting with Cornwell, because Cornwell is so great at this. But for this trilogy itself, it's the inventiveness. It's taking the story you know and explaining away a lot of the things that you see, like magical elements, explaining how a real world element could be perceived as a narrator or a storyteller as something magical. His play on some of the characters is incredible. I mean, just wait till you see what he does with Lancelot. It's so inventive, it's so creative, and it's so well written. And if you're someone who likes action sequences, with apologies to some of the best, George R.R. Martin, Joe Abercrombie, Bernard Cornwell's the best. Number 2, The Lord of the Rings. Perhaps the one book series on this list that needs no introduction, I'll introduce it nonetheless. The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien was originally conceived as a single novel by Tolkien, but broken into 3 volumes by the publisher, all published in the 1950s. Its influence on the fantasy genre cannot be overstated, as it is still for many the gold standard, as it codified most of the fantasy tropes employed even today, and proved a huge shadow for fantasy authors for decades. That shadow was real, because authors, and maybe more importantly publishers, wouldn't publish fantasy novels unless it was in the vein that Tolkien created. If it didn't seem reminiscent from Tolkien, they were a lot more reluctant to publish your works. Now, there are outliers in those eras, but pretty much from the 60s, 70s, 80s, even into the 90s, most of the fantasy being published was along the Tolkien formula. Even Robert Jordan with The Wheel of Time, the first book is very Tolkien-esque, and then he goes his own direction. Terry Brooks, who was one of the best-selling authors of the 80s, same thing. Sword of Shannara is the Fellowship of the Ring, and then he goes his own direction. And one of the reasons is not just the codification of all of these tropes, but the depth of his stories. I've read The Lord of the Rings 4 times now, and every time I read it, I discover something new. I recently saw a fantasy author who will remain nameless in an interview talking about how they wrote 100 pages of history for their world, and then they wrote like an 8-book series for it. And I just think about Tolkien, who wrote thousands upon thousands of pages of history and lore in Middle-earth to tell 2 stories. And it shines through on the page. The depth of that world has not been equaled. And the depth of Middle-earth is so vivid and just fully realized that you can picture it so clearly. It's readable and it's highly rereadable. And for decades was my favorite book series. But it's number 2. So who's number 1? A recent addition to this list. Number 1, The Realm of the Elderlings. The Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb is a 16-book series that is broken up into 5 sub-series, 3 of which who follow a central protagonist throughout his entire lifetime. A character-driven drama, The Realm of the Elderlings features some of the best character writing I have read, with a writing style by Robin Hobb that is simply sublime. The Realm of the Elderlings is the most emotionally moving literary journey I've ever taken. So yes, it took an author of the skill of Robin Hobb to upend Tolkien for me. And the biggest reason is this is the most emotionally moving and emotionally satisfying journey I've taken in literature. I've read emotionally moving novels, but as far as a book series is concerned, this one takes the cake. 9 of these books follow one character that you really get to know, Fitz, all the way through these great books. In between the 2 series, in between the Fitz series, you get some fantastic world building, great magic, and you learn the bigger part of the story of what she's telling. It's such a remarkable journey. It's much like Tolkien. It's very readable, but highly rereadable. I've heard some critics of this series talk about the slow-moving plots, and I won't refute that it's slow-moving plot. But frankly, how do I say this without insulting people? Frankly, I think the world's in too much of a damn hurry. A fast-moving plot is not necessarily a great thing. In Hobb's case, when she gives you a slow-moving plot, she gives you great character development and meaningful world building. So things are going on. The plot may not be moving forward, but other things are happening which are just as fantastic. She is one of the most brilliant writers I have read, and that includes all of the classic writers I have read. She has a command of the English language that frankly surpasses everybody I've read in this genre. Fitz is a character that has fast become my favorite literary character. Spoiler alert for that top 10 list. And this is a book series that I'm so glad that I discovered, because The Realm of the Elderlings, for me, is my favorite book series. All right, that's my top 10. I hope I didn't make anybody mad about talking about slow-moving plots. But anyway, what are your top 10? Where do mine rank in yours? Have you read these? Based on what I like, what do you think I would like that might break into this top 10? That's probably the question I'd love to see most answered in the comments section. Hey, if you like this video, please like and subscribe. Also, find me on Twitter and Goodreads. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Till next time, goodbye.